Hey y'all! Welcome to Social Studies with Miss Rogers, World History Edition. Today we're going to focus on the Pacific Theater, the other half of World War II. Even though the events we're talking about today are on the other side of the globe, some of them are still taking place at the same time as some of the World War II events in Europe, so I'll try to let you know when that happens. Since World War II officially ends with the surrender of Japan, we're going to see the finale of our Second World War today. So, let's get started. As we've learned previously, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany in 1940, which means that's the year Japan officially joins World War II. And this is a few months after Italy joins the war. So Italy and Japan both join World War II in the same year, but Italy does join a few months beforehand. Don't forget that by this point, Japan has already invaded Manchuria, already captured parts of northeastern China, and even occupies Korea. So it's not as if Japan is seeking to establish their first colonies right now. They're looking to expand their already fairly large conquest. As we talked about when we discussed the European theater, with France being out of the picture, Japan was heavily interested in the colonies belonging to the Western European nations, especially French Indochina, since France has already fallen to the Germans. The United States is not a fan of these conquests. Remember, America has territory in the Pacific, and seeing Japan on a conquest spree makes them a little bit nervous for their own territories and the business dealings they have there. This is where America freezes Japanese assets, including that oil embargo that angered the Japanese so much. As the Japanese said, the dagger that points towards Japan must be destroyed. To the Japanese, that dagger, that threat, was the United States. And the way for them to deal with said dagger is to take the offensive and strike. In America, we focus heavily on the attack of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. In this attack that Japan is making, they not only bomb Pearl Harbor, but also many other areas such as Malaya, Singapore, Guam, which is a US military base, the Philippines, which also is a US possession, Hong Kong, it will include Burma, the Indies. This is very bold. The Japanese took a very bold offensive approach, and it would be this move that would ultimately cost the Axis powers the war, because it's this move that brings the US into the war officially on the Allies' side. Japan saw numerous victories early on in the war. Their giant offensive strategy won them territories such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Guam, and many more. They ended up conquering over 1 million square miles of Asian land, including 150 million people. Japan did not treat the people they conquered nicely, but the worst treatment of all was saved for prisoners of war. Japanese people saw surrender as dishonorable and would often commit the suicidal act of seppuku rather than surrender themselves to an enemy. So the Japanese really looked down on the prisoners of war for being too weak to honorably kill themselves. At this point, the Japanese seemed unbeatable. However, the first notable event in the Pacific Theater would prove otherwise. American Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle would lead what we now call the Doolittle Raid. He sent a small group of B-25 bombers to attack mainland Japan. A couple of American lives were lost, which is always unfortunate, though most of these crewmen not only make the attack, but also get to their landing destination alive and well. The Doolittle Raids don't do much damage at all, but this quote-unquote win for the Allies was not about damage or territory. It was a psychological win. It was proof that Japan was not untouchable. Exactly the kind of morale boost the Americans needed, and exactly the kind of reality check they were hoping to give to the Japanese. About a month later, we see our first real naval engagement between the Japanese and the Americans, and this is called the Battle of Coral Sea, which took place right about here. The Battle of Coral Sea is really significant to World War II in our Pacific Theater because even though both sides experienced really heavy losses, the Americans were able to stop the Japanese from advancing further south. The losses the Japanese experienced at the Battle of Coral Sea also made the American victory at the Battle of Midway possible, and that was one of the most important victories of all. The Battle of Midway was a Japanese offensive, meaning the Japanese were the ones attacking. And their goal at this battle, located right about here on the island of Midway, is to further weaken the United States. The Americans knew this attack was coming, thanks to codebreakers, and they made sure they were prepared. The Battle of Midway ended up not only being a real American victory, but the first time America's Navy was able to beat Japan's. Historians say that the Battle of Midway was such a major victory for the Americans that it officially turned the tides of the Pacific Theater. And what I mean by turn the tides of the Pacific Theater is that because of this major victory, the Americans are feeling really great. They're now taking the offensive. They're now taking the fight to the Japanese. The only issue with the Pacific Theater, though, is that the battlefields are so scattered and spread out. You don't have a giant chunk of land to keep advancing on. You have random islands throughout the ocean where different battles are fought and bases are set up. American General Douglas MacArthur has a solution to this inconvenient problem: island hopping. In island hopping, soldiers would seize weakly defended islands closer to Japan, and as the Allies got closer and closer to their targets, they would use these islands as their bases whenever they needed. The first island MacArthur seized in island hopping was Guadalcanal. The Japanese were trying to build a huge airbase on Guadalcanal, right over here, and MacArthur's troops worked as fast as possible so that they could take the island before the airbase was finished and turned into a Japanese stronghold. This initial attack turned into a 6-month-long battle, but it did end up with Japan deciding to abandon this island of death, and Guadalcanal became the first Allied product of island hopping. This is also around the time of the siege of Leningrad, when Hitler's attacking the Soviet Union. So now the Americans island hop closer and closer to Japan, taking islands as they go so they can set up military bases closer to their target, which, of course, is mainland Japan. As the Americans get closer to the mainland, the Japanese go all in at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in an attempt to stop American advances, and it does not at all go well for the Japanese. Thanks to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy is pretty much destroyed, meaning the Americans have the upper hand here. The Japanese Navy is destroyed, the Americans are gaining control of territories surrounding Japan, and there's really no stopping them from advancing further towards the mainland. As Americans get closer, some of the bloodiest campaigns that the Allies and Japanese face include battles at Okinawa, at Iwo Jima, lots of bloodshed, lots of death, and even one of the most famous military photos ever taken is of Marines storming Iwo Jima. The Allies do end up taking these islands, but it's not without a heavy cost of Allied soldiers' lives. And now at this point, all that's left for the Allies to face was the Japanese army and the kamikaze. Side note, kamikazes were suicide pilots who would attack by flying their planes into enemy ships. Fighting both of these aspects of the Japanese military would cost a lot of lives, and we've already lost so many, which will now take us to one of the biggest dilemmas of World War II. US President Truman was told that taking on the Japanese mainland would cost a lot of American lives. Some sources say 500,000, some say over 1 million. Regardless, that's a lot of soldiers. Truman was told there was an alternative to the many American lives at stake, and that would be the atomic bombs. Secretly in America, scientists have been working on something called the Manhattan Project. You see, this amazing scientist named Albert Einstein, maybe you've heard of him, with a Jewish background, fled Germany for obvious reasons. He settled in America and wrote to his new president, hey, it might be a great idea to build an atomic bomb before Hitler figures out how to do it. I'm just saying. So this idea of a superweapon was already in circulation in the science community. Einstein had gotten word from friends overseas that there was a strong possibility Germany would get a hold of such a weapon, and he wanted to urge the president of the US to build their own. Einstein was a pacifist, meaning that he didn't like fighting. He was very against war. But being as smart as he was, He knew it was only a matter of time before some world power figured out how to create this kind of weapon, and he had to figure out who would be the safest to develop it. His options were the Americans, the Germans, and the Russians. He put his money on the Americans. So the Americans, with the help of Canadians and European scientists, developed the Manhattan Project. This was a super top secret project, and it was in this super secret project where the scientists developed these atomic weapons. Even the rest of the American government didn't know about this project until it was already completed. Truman did discuss the Manhattan Project with his Allied peers, but not until it was finished. Truman was actually pretty bummed out when Stalin was not really excited about this idea of atomic bombs. That's because Stalin had his own spies in the Manhattan Project, and he knew about it the entire time. He was actually really ticked off that Truman didn't tell him about it sooner, but that's besides the point. We already knew that Stalin had an ego problem. When this atomic weapon was finished and tested, Truman was offered the weapon to use instead of sending in more US troops to Japan and risking countless lives. And he first decided to give Japan a chance to back down. He warned them that something big would be coming if they didn't surrender. Truman gave Japan multiple weeks to send a response, but they never did, which Truman took as a sign of refusal to surrender, and he dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The first atomic bomb, named Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, and the second bomb, named Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, August 9th. Truman said he never questioned or regretted his decision. He said it saved the world at a minimum another year of war, it saved billions of dollars, and numerous American lives that would have been lost if he chose to invade Japan with men. Not long after the bombs were dropped, Japan signed an unconditional surrender, and thus we have both VJ Day, victory in Japan, and the official end of World War II. Truman said one of the reasons he felt so confident in his decision is because using the atomic bombs on Japan has kept any nation from using them since, which he felt was good for the world. And now that the threat of fascism is gone, it's time to make room for new threats and new tensions. As we clean up the aftermath of World War II, we'll continue seeing tensions between the US and the USSR develop into the next world issue, the Cold War. So, I'll see you then.